bulging waistlines and the $320 billion industry. We're asking if diets are actually good for our health. Also on today's program, an unhappy marriage. We ask whether the special relationship between the United States and Saudi Arabia can last. And in picture this, liftoff at last. Russia launches its first rocket from a new spaceport after a series of delays. Hello and welcome to the Newsmakers with me, Imran Garda. In today's modern consumer culture, choice is king. Choose anything, and there'll be thousands of companies trying to cater to your every need. And while that means booming business and tailor-made lifestyles, it also affects the way we live and our health. Since 1980, worldwide obesity has doubled. It's created a weight loss industry worth an estimated $320 billion worldwide. Many diets are now highly commercialized operations, selling a lifestyle as well as their products. But is some people's obsession with their diets a necessity, or is it simply another means of signposting who they are? Today's Newsmaker is the diet industry, as we ask whether dieting is healthy or harmful.
What to eat or what not to eat? That is the question driving a multi-billion-dollar diet industry. Whether you're cutting carbs or counting calories, there are hundreds of schemes and products sold around the world to help customers lose weight and fast.
Look who's back! 50 pounds down thanks to Jenny Craig.
But do any of them actually work? In the dieting world, the science is confusing and contradicting. But by their very nature, diets create loyal followings. In South Africa, the so-called Banting diet has swept the nation. It cuts out all carbohydrates, and many swear by it. But its protein regime has been criticized for being elitist.
We're talking about the fat and the eggs and the bacon, and I said, yo, how am I gonna afford all this stuff and I'm unemployed?
It might be one reason why fashionable dieting is in decline. Market leader Weight Watchers has reported sales drops since 2014. Revenue has also shrunk at Jenny Craig. Another challenge to the diet world is research suggesting that diets don't work in the long term, and that cutting out food triggers the body to store fat in response to starvation. But apart from whether they help to lose weight, experts are increasingly asking whether diets are healthy. One of the biggest criticisms against weight loss has been the promotion of an unattainable body image. Studies show that young girls who diet early are likely to develop eating disorders. But equally concerning is rising obesity. In 2015, 2.7 billion people around the world were overweight. The good news is the world is becoming more health conscious. Consumers are eating more fresh food and exercising more often. It may not be such good news for the weight loss industry. Sandra Gatman, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now to discuss the world of weight loss, we have nutritionist Charlotte Debeugny from Paris and author of the book The Real Meal Revolution, Tim Noakes, joining us from Cape Town. Thanks both of you for joining us. Professor Tim Noakes, let me start with you. People don't really know who to trust. If we look at the past few decades, first people were told, hey, you've got to cut fat. Now they're told, hey, cut carbs, cut sugar. Next they're going to say, cut protein, right? I don't know who to trust.
Well, I think you need to look at what humans have been eating for 3 million years. And up till 1977, we were doing very well. We were eating lots of fat and lots of protein and relatively little carbohydrate. And then the United States, in their wisdom, decided that we should all start eating lots of cereals and grains, and we should make carbohydrates the basis for all our meals. Tragically, that was the wrong information. There was no evidence for that. There was no evidence base. So we got the world eating lots of carbohydrates, hopefully not the French, but certainly the rest of the world. And we started getting fat and obese and diabetic. And so obesity and diabetes begins in 1977, not in 1967, not in 1957, but in 1977, concurrent with these new dietary guidelines. I'm a biologist, and I'm both a medical doctor, biologist, and a scientist, and I study biology. And when you look at the biology, it's very easy to understand why this diet change caused the obesity and diabetes epidemic. Because what's happening is once you start eating carbohydrates, you don't become satiated, you become hungry. And as a consequence, you eat more calories, and as a consequence, you get fat. And then that's the first point. And the second point is we have a global epidemic of this condition called insulin resistance. And if you're insulin resistant, you cannot metabolize carbohydrate. And if you give carbohydrates to people who are insulin resistant, you will make them fat, and you will give them diabetes, and you will give them heart disease, and probably cancer and dementia. So that's what we've done. We've taken the substrate, which is insulin resistance, which is the most prevalent medical condition in the globe. We said eat lots of carbohydrate, and the outcome was obvious and apparent. And now we wonder why we got the problem.
Okay. Charlotte, Tim Noakes is a supporter and a guru of this Banting paleo diet. Is that a healthy lifestyle, or is it a fad, in your opinion?
No, I mean, I think there, as Tim said, there's a real scientific basis for that. It's actually also known as the ketogenic diet. So it has been used in France, I think from the early 1900s, to treat uncontrollable epilepsy. So, you know, that's also one of the things the ketogenic diet does. It actually calms the brain. So that was also the basis. Though yes, it does start with Thomas Banting. I'm just going to say that the decision to reduce fat, though, was actually based on epidemiological studies. It was based on the seven countries study by Ansel Keys. Is that the study you're referring to, Tim, which is in the 1970s?
Oh, no, yeah, that's right. But there was no evidence, and that was associational studies. And associational studies don't prove causation. There have been 10 studies in which we have reduced the saturated fat in the diet, replaced it with polyunsaturated fats, as we're told to do, and the outcome was no benefit. And the most recent study was the Minnesota Heart Study, which was republished a few weeks ago in the British Medical Journal. This was a study set up by Ansel Keys in 1968 to prove his hypothesis. Unfortunately, it disproved it. So what did Ansel Keys do? Well, he hid the data, and it was only rediscovered and published in the British Medical Journal 2 weeks ago. So the problem is we've had 10 studies, including the Women's Health Initiative, which cost $700 million to prove the low-fat diet makes you healthy. It doesn't.
Okay.
So Keys was wrong. All the evidence subsequently has not shown that the low-fat diet is healthy and improves our health, whereas there's so much evidence that a low-fat diet causes obesity and diabetes, and we just simply ignore it as if it doesn't exist.
Okay, Charlotte, so Tim's a fan of fat, you're not. You're cautious. Why?
No, I mean, I am actually, I like fats. I like good fats. I think the trouble with fats is that they are more calorific. So, for example, they're 9 calories for a gram as opposed to protein or carbs, which are 4 calories a gram. Given the current epidemic of obesity, should we be telling people to stuff their faces with fat? I'm not sure that's the answer. I think it's probably something in between. I agree about the Ansel Keys study has now been, there's now questions coming out about the original study. But I think it was never Ansel Keys' intention for people to sort of start munching on tons of low-fat foods either. It was purely a link that excessive fats, because of the cholesterol link, could cause, were linked to cardiovascular disease. But I think it was never his intention to have, reams of low-fat foods. That's something the food industry has taken on, but certainly doesn't stem from Ansel Keys.
Okay, so Tim, final question for you, because when it comes to what we eat, it does seem to become a moral argument for many people, a sort of good and evil. With that in mind, and all the troubles you've had recently facing hearings and backlash, do you regret advising moms on social media to wean their babies off carbs?
No, absolutely not, because what's the option? To give them these high sugar foods, that cereals and grains, that will cause them to become obese and diabetic. You see, it's all very well saying it's inconvenient to eat less carbohydrate, but I'll tell you what's really inconvenient. What's really inconvenient is to develop type 2 diabetes, to lose your sight, to lose your kidney function, have to go onto dialysis, to you lose your legs, to have a stroke, to become demented. That's what's the problem. And we're not facing up to it. The medical care in the United States of America, in the United Kingdom, and in South Africa will be bankrupted by the diabetes epidemic in 10 to 15 years. That's what's going to become inconvenient. And we have to say, guys, the time has come for us to start eating properly as the way biologically we're designed to eat.
Okay.
And we are biologically designed to eat lots of fat, little less protein, and very little carbohydrates. And particularly as you get older, that becomes more and more important.
Okay, I usually have a bit of dark chocolate after the program. I resent you for making me feel guilty about it now. I don't know how it's going to go down. Tim Noakes, Charlotte Debeugny, fascinating discussion. Hope to have you two on again sometime soon. Thank you very much for joining us. Still to come on the Newsmakers, the shifting sands in the US-Saudi relationship. And in Picture This, a Russian rocket makes it into space after a series of delays. President Obama visited Saudi Arabia recently, a trip aimed at reassuring his allies in the Gulf that America remains fully behind them. But Obama's administration and the Gulf nations hold wildly divergent views on the Iran nuclear deal and the war in Syria. And there's no sign they will resolve them anytime soon. The Newsmakers' Randolph Noakes reports.
An air of discontent in U.S.-Saudi relations. As oil prices continue to fall, Americans are relying less on the kingdom for energy. And regional conflicts are testing U.S. ties with its longtime ally. The latest diplomatic thorn is over new accusations that Saudi Arabia was involved in the 9/11 attacks. U.S. President Barack Obama's last official visit to Riyadh was meant to clear the air, but Obama was met with less pomp than expected. Saudi Arabia's former intelligence chief, Prince Turki Al Faisal, has suggested a retuning of bilateral ties is needed. Perhaps what has most strained the controversial U.S.-Saudi partnership is the reemergence of Iran into the international fold. July 2015 marked the beginning of a new chapter in Iranian relations with the West. The Iran deal lifted economic sanctions and limited the country's nuclear program. It marked a departure from unequivocal U.S. support for Saudi Arabia's regional agenda.
None of our nations have an interest in conflict with Iran. We welcome an Iran that plays a responsible role in the region.
Another point of contention, Saudi-led airstrikes against Iran-backed Houthi rebels in Yemen. Washington has quietly criticized Riyadh for the humanitarian toll of its intervention and for not making al-Qaeda in Yemen a military priority. But the U.S.-Saudi relationship is still too intertwined to fully unravel. The arms for oil pact between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia is the foundation of their bilateral ties. For years, the complaints of rights groups over Saudi Arabia's treatment of women and religious minorities have fallen on deaf ears. The U.S. sees Saudi Arabia as a partner in its fight against Daesh and other groups threatening regional security. And Saudi Arabia is the #1 customer of U.S. arms manufacturers. But some critics say the U.S. pays too high a price for its military alliance with Saudi Arabia, and that Riyadh is fueling sectarianism and militancy. But as U.S. interests in the region continue to evolve, an 80-year alliance is likely to be further strained. Randolph Noakes, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now to discuss how President Obama's presidency has shaped U.S.-Saudi relations is James Smith. He served as U.S. ambassador to Saudi Arabia from 2009 to 2013 and joins me from Washington, D.C. Ambassador Smith, thanks a lot for joining us. The relationship seems to be strained for the moment. Who needs whom more?
Well, I think both countries need each other. I think you're right in the introduction that the relationship, which started in earnest in 1945, was based on oil for security. But keep in mind, the first construction of a U.S. firm was Dhahran Air Base. So in reality, our security concerns, as we emerged into the Cold War, were every bit as important as Saudi Arabia's security concerns. And I would say that stability in the region and U.S. strategic interests trump any issue about oil.
Okay, let's talk 9/11 for a moment. Much of the United States foreign policy over the past decade and a half has been in response to that. 2 wars were waged, arguably, in response to 9/11. The 28 redacted pages of the 9/11 Commission. I interviewed Senator Bob Graham. He wants them released. He read them. He says they indicate Saudi involvement in 9/11. I also interviewed the former U.S. ambassador to Saudi Arabia, Robert Jordan. He also read the pages and he says they don't have the smoking gun and that they do not indicate direct Saudi involvement in 9/11. Presumably you've read those 28 pages. Where do you stand on this, and do you think they should be? No, I have not. Okay, do you believe they should be released?
Well, again, I have not read them and I have no position on them. If they are made public, then I certainly would be in a position to comment.
If there's a possibility that there was Saudi involvement in 9/11, don't you think it would be in the public interest to release them?
Again, you're asking me a hypothetical. There's certainly nothing about the 5 years of engagement with the Saudi government that led me to believe that the Saudi government was involved. Clearly, there were Saudi individuals involved because 15 of the 19 hijackers on 9/11 were Saudis. That was part of a well-constructed plan by Osama bin Laden. I am in no position to know what fits in between. If there were individuals who happened to be in the government that were associated, I have no idea.
Okay. Let's move on for a second and broaden it out again to the region. The president has used the term free riders in his interview with Jeffrey Goldberg when referring to Saudi Arabia and others. The Saudis have been saying to many people that under President Obama, it's better to be America's enemy than to be her friend, and that the U.S. seems to respect her enemies more than it respects her friends. Is that true?
Of course it's not true. And this is the impact of indelicate remarks on the part of both governments that take the attention away from the importance of relationship. Certainly those comments are what's being debated in the media. I can assure you, when the president sat down with King Salman, the conversation was about real issues in the region, very important issues that we and our allies in the region need to work through together. It was not about comments like those.
Do you believe that we're in the middle of a Cold War in the region between Saudi Arabia and Iran?
You have been in a war since 1979. I would not call it a Cold War because you have in Iran's efforts since 1979 to destabilize the region. And this is all an issue of power, relative power. And if your neighbors are weak, then you're more powerful. So that's where Iran has focused their attention. Their tactic has been sectarian conflict to fuel the fire of destabilization. And in Daesh, they have instability in its most lethal form. On the other hand, the Saudis have undertook a strategy of stabilization at all costs, stability, and have exported their unique brand of Salafism, which is very intolerant and And what you see in the region now is the unintended consequences of the foreign policy of both of those countries are contributing to much of the chaos we have in the region.
President Obama also said he wants the Saudis and the Iranians to share the region. Is that visionary or is that naive?
I don't think it's naive. It creates a challenge. And the challenge is when you're 8,000 miles away, you can look at a problem a little more objectively than when you're surrounded by chaos around you. Now, having said that, if you go back to President Obama's first campaign in 2007, 2008, he laid out 4 principles of foreign policy in the region. One was to end the bad war, which he deemed was Iraq, win the good war, which he determined was Afghanistan, be willing to engage with friends and foe alike. He has done that successfully with Cuba, some success with Iran in terms of the nuclear arrangement, no success at all with North Korea, but he's held to his word there. And he said, do not get involved in wars not of our choosing or not in U.S. interests. So whether you agree or disagree with those principles, he has been remarkably consistent in his foreign policy over these last 8 years.
Ambassador Smith, you spoke of unintended consequences of policies. You also spoke of Saudi Arabia's intolerant brand of Wahhabi Salafi Islam that it pushes out. Looking back at your time as ambassador, do you have any regrets that you didn't push them harder to stop that spread of the intolerance in the region and to do more on women's rights and on human rights in general?
Actually, I'm quite proud of the success that we had in those 4+ years. Not of my doing, but of watching a whole range of initiatives that impact women in Saudi Arabia. The election of 30 members of the Shura Council who are making fundamental changes for women in Saudi Arabia today. The opening of more and more career paths for women. When I got there in 2009, there were 18,000 Saudi students studying in the United States. When I left, there were 95,000, and nearly half of them were women. So they're on a trajectory to educate an entire generation of young women, and I think this is a positive path.
But if you'll forgive me for being direct and very specific, for example, in 2012, when Muri al-Asiri was beheaded for witchcraft, for just possessing books on witchcraft, and bloggers were put on death row for poetry, like Hamza Kashgari. Now we're seeing Raif Badawi. When things like that were happening, how would you engage? Would you directly respond to that and say, hey, we find it unacceptable that you've just beheaded someone in the 21st century for witchcraft? Would there be a direct engagement?
Of course there would, but the engagements that we do are probably not in public, and if you're going to achieve success in diplomacy, that is largely going to be through quiet diplomatic efforts.
This has been thoroughly interesting. It's been great to talk to you. Thank you very much for joining us. In today's Picture This, Russia is celebrating the successful launch of its first rocket from the new Vostochny cosmodrome. Let's take a look. Today's newsmaker has been the diet industry, as we asked whether it's really helping us to lose weight. The industry has rapidly expanded over the past 40 years, but so have our waistlines. 2 billion adults are now overweight, and as living standards rise in the developing world, that figure will too. Changes in what we eat and how much mean we will need to change our habits. The UN thinks the world will need to produce 70% more food by 2050 to feed a global population that's expected to reach 9 billion. You've been watching this edition of The Newsmakers with me, Imran Garda. As always, thanks for watching. Bye-bye.